Okay, so we're back, and now we're going to talk about that second fundamental shift that happens in adolescence, and this has to do with the cognitive transitions. And so what we see happening in adolescence is that adolescents themselves start thinking in different ways than children. So it's not just that they know more. Of course they know more. They have more life experience, they've been in school for longer, they've been exposed to much more. But they also start thinking about things in really, really different ways. And so just as a quick example, because this just happened for me yesterday, literally. So my mother's birthday is coming up, and I was talking to my daughter, who's 5, and I said, because we can't see your grandmother this year for her birthday, we can't celebrate with her, let's make her like a really special card/art project. And we talked about it, and we decided to make like a cake, and we were gonna cut out candles and put them on. And then I said, let's also write down some wishes that we have for your grandmother, right? So things that, when she's blowing out the candles on the cake, she could wish for. And so in my mind, as an adult, I'm like, we wish we could be there celebrating with you. We wish that we'll be able to travel soon. We wish that we'll be able to see you soon. And my daughter goes, I wish she was a mermaid. And I'm like, okay, well, what else do you wish for her? She's like, I wish she was a fairy. And I'm like, how about wishing her a happy birthday? She's like, yeah, that too. So here I am cutting out these little thought bubbles, and I'm like, I wish you were a fairy. I wish you were a mermaid. I wish you a happy birthday. And then mine are like, I wish we could be together celebrating. I wish you all that you wish for yourself and more, right? So very different way of thinking. But my daughter, as a young child who happens to love fairies and mermaids and unicorns, I'm actually pretty glad she didn't suggest that her grandmother should turn into a unicorn, because that one is a little trickier. She was thinking more the way a child thinks. And so we see this shift start happening in adolescence, that adolescents start thinking about things in very different ways, and in ways that are more similar to adults than similar to children. Okay? There are 5 big changes in cognition, or changes in the way we think, that happen in adolescence. The first is what we call thinking about possibilities. Children are very oriented to what is happening right here, right now. So if you're talking to a child, a young child, about school, they just think it'll be exactly like it is in their current grade, because that's what school is. And even though, let's say we're talking to a second grader, so a child in grade 2, they know that kindergarten was one way, and grade 1 was one way, and grade 2 is one way, but if you ask them what grade 3 will be like, they'll just say it'll be just like grade 2. Because they're very focused on what is happening right now. On the other hand, if you talk to an adolescent about what school might be like, they can start thinking about more possibilities. They're drawing on all their years. So particularly as the transition to high school comes about, and so you're like, what do you think high school will be like? And it's like, well, okay. Grade 9 was really quite different from grade 6, and I imagine we're going to continue moving in that direction of, I'm going to get to pick some of my classes, I might have some electives, I might get to choose which language I want to learn instead of being told which language I'm going to learn. I might get to focus more on the arts, because that's what interests me. I'm going to move to different classrooms throughout the day rather than being in one classroom. So they're able to think about more components. But to a young child, trying to explain that to them, their minds would be blown. They would be like, no, that can't be. No. You have like one teacher. That's how it goes. Okay. So that's one thing that we see. What we also see happening in terms of this thinking about possibilities is adolescents are starting to be able to engage in deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is when we draw a conclusion from a set of givens. And so in the textbook, they give an example that hockey players wear mouth guards. Kara is a hockey player. So the logical conclusion from deductive reasoning is that Kara wears a mouth guard, right? Because we know that hockey players wear mouth guards. We know that she's a hockey player, so therefore she must wear a mouth guard, right? For this day and age, responsible people wear masks when they leave their home. We are all responsible people. Therefore, we all wear our masks as we're supposed to. Yes, a slight little lesson in there for you. Make sure you're wearing your mask, okay? The other thing that happens in adolescence is adolescents are starting to be able to engage in hypothetical thinking, so that if-then thinking, and that also really helps with perspective taking. So again, thinking back to that wish example that I shared with you just a few minutes ago, my daughter can't really take the perspective of her grandmother and think, what would my grandmother wish for her birthday? My daughter thinks that when she blows out the candles on her cake, she really wants to be a mermaid or a fairy. So that's her wish, right? That's certainly not going to be my mother's wish. I really don't think my mother wants to be a mermaid, maybe a fairy, but definitely not a mermaid. But my daughter is too young and her brain doesn't work in a way to be able to take that other perspective and think, well, what would my grandmother actually want? It's kind of like when you ask children, young children, to go pick out a present for someone else, they pick out what they want, right? They can't think about what does someone else want. It's like, well, this is what I want. So that's what we see happening, one of the changes. Another change that we see in adolescence is this ability to think about abstract concepts. Okay, so adolescents can think about things like politics, which I'm not going to talk about today, religion, morals, okay? So if you took, for an example, something like vegetarianism, a child might say, well, I don't eat meat because I don't like it, right? They're not thinking about, I feel bad for the animals. They're not thinking about, how feedlot, and I know I'm in Alberta and I shouldn't be talking like this, but I don't like how feedlots are run. I don't like how the animals are treated. I believe that animals have souls and I don't want to eat something with a soul. Those are things we might hear from an adolescent as to why they've chosen a vegetarian lifestyle. From a child, we're going to hear, I don't like the way it tastes or smells or looks, right? They're not going to be thinking about those higher order things, those abstract concepts. They certainly, unless they live on a ranch or have parents who work at a feedlot, they probably don't have a really good idea about how animals are treated. And again, I'm not saying that they're all treated badly. I'm just going to leave it alone because I recognize that this is Alberta. Okay, thinking about thinking is another change that we see happening in adolescence, and we refer to this as metacognition. Okay, and metacognition is that process of thinking about what we're thinking about. And that's something that is new in adolescence, that we can actually think about our thoughts and sort of think about what they mean. Young children can't do that. The other thing, and I enjoy talking about this, so I'm really going to have to sort of limit myself a little bit, is this idea of adolescent egocentrism. So David Elkind, years ago, proposed this theory that said that adolescents are just really self-absorbed. And it's interesting because, we talked in biological transitions about how adolescents go through a growth spurt that is roughly toddler-like. And in some ways, adolescent egocentrism is almost toddler-like in terms of narcissism and egocentrism. Young children, toddler-age kids, really think they are all that, and they only think about themselves. And then we see that in adolescence as well. And so Elkind talked about these two components to adolescent egocentrism, one being the imaginary audience and the other being the personal fable. The imaginary audience is the sense that adolescents have that other people are watching and criticizing and evaluating and judging them all the time. So an adolescent would wake up in the morning, notice that they have a pimple on their face, and think, oh my God, I can't possibly go to school. everybody's going to be staring at that pimple. People are going to wonder if I don't know how to wash my face, if I'm dirty, if, I forgot to do something, or I forgot to take medication. Like, who knows? I can't possibly go, everybody's going to notice. Yeah, the reality is everybody's so busy worried about themselves, nobody's noticing. But try telling that to an adolescent, right? Because this imaginary audience is this idea that every single move they make, everything they do is under scrutiny of their peers and adults all the time. The personal fable has to do with this idea that adolescents tend to think of themselves as unique and special, and as a result, the rules that apply to other people don't apply to them. So I know as an adolescent that I'm not supposed to drink and drive. A, it's illegal for me to drink because I'm not 18 yet. But B, drinking and driving is really bad. But I also know that my parents let me take the car to go to this party, and I promised them I wouldn't drink, but now I did drink, and I really don't think I'm drunk, and I think it's better for me to drive home and get the car home than have to call my parents and tell them that I was drinking, because nothing bad is going to happen, right? Like, things happen to other people, but like, I'm okay until they wrap the car around a utility pole because they were actually way above the legal limit. That's the personal fable. Well, I know that I could get pregnant if I have unprotected sex, but that's not going to happen because I'm special. Until 9 months later, they're a parent, right? So those are things that Elkind suggested happen for a lot of adolescents, that they get wrapped up in themselves in this idea of this adolescent egocentrism. They think everybody's watching them, judging them, and they think that they're really special and nothing bad can happen to them. What we know is that the personal fable tends to endure beyond adolescence. And right now in our society, we are seeing that with a lot of people who are refusing to follow the public health guidelines for COVID. We're seeing people, and I don't know about you, but I get really annoyed when I see news articles of, I didn't believe it, but now I have it, and I'm really sick, and you really should wear a mask. And I'm like, idiot, you should have been wearing a mask in the first place and not leaving your house. Like, this could have all been over a long time ago if people had actually done what they were supposed to do. But so many people thought, well, it's not going to happen to me. I'm really careful. But do you guys remember, and maybe you don't, you might be too young, but many years ago they sort of were pushing the idea, again, this was in terms of unprotected sex, that when you have sex with someone, you're having sex with every person they've had sex with, and sex with every person that they had sex with, and on and on and on. And why it's so important that unless you are in a totally monogamous relationship and you've both been tested for sexually transmitted infections, that you always use some sort of protection, particularly in this case condoms, because other forms of birth control don't protect against STIs. And so that's the same thing with COVID right now in the personal fable. You might be really careful. And you might think that the friend who you're going to visit has been really careful. And they have been really careful, but they had that one slip up where they were at a party with 100 people and nobody was in masks. Oopsies. And now you're in intensive care. So we know the personal fable is not unique to adolescents. So we know that that part of Elkind's theory is not quite accurate. But it is a really interesting concept, thinking particularly about the imaginary audience and the impact that can have. Okay. Another change in cognition is this ability to think in multiple dimensions. And so one of the things that enables is sarcasm. Young children do not get sarcasm. Young children are very literal. Adolescents start to get sarcasm, and then they start to use sarcasm. And that's the point at which you wish you could send your adolescent to boarding school because you don't like dealing with the sarcasm that comes out of your adolescent's mouth. But that's something that develops because they can think in multiple ways. And then finally, adolescent relativism. which is the movement away from black and white thinking. Again, children tend to be very much into black and white thinking. This is right, this is wrong. Adolescents start understanding that there's shades of gray, right? So, okay, and again, I'm just going to use COVID as a framework. An adolescent has to make a decision. My parents are talking about going away on vacation because they feel like they've been working really hard and it's been a really tough year. And I kind of agree with them on that, but at the same time, I know that the public health officials have said there should be no non-essential travel. But if I'm just feeling really drained and like I just really need to be shut off from the world and just disconnect for a little bit, that's going to be really good for my mental health. So should I do it, right? So an adolescent can start thinking like that. Yes, the rule is you shouldn't travel, but here are all these reasons why maybe it's okay. And by the way, I'm not talking about adolescents, but in fact our elected officials, since they just did that over Christmas. But that's another story. Politicians, adolescents, same thing, roughly. Okay, I said I wasn't going to get political. I fail at that every time. Okay. So in terms of thinking a little bit about thinking, for a really long time, a lot of people hung on to Piaget's views of adolescent thinking. And you, I'm sure, heard about Piaget in lifespan development, and certainly also if you took child development. And he proposed a cognitive developmental view with 4 stages. So sensory motor period, birth to 2 years old. Our thinking is really based on our movement and what we touch and what we feel. The pre-operational period from about 2 to 5 years old. Concrete operations from 6 to early adolescence. And of course, this corresponds with starting school. So all the things that we start learning those very finite things like math rules, right? And language rules, and understanding that letters have to go in a particular sequence to make a word. And then finally, formal operations, which begins in adolescence and takes us into adulthood. And Piaget proposed this as something that this is how our thinking develops. We go through each of these stages in order, and boom, we wind up at formal operations. However, there's not a lot of support for this. There isn't a lot of support that cognitive development really happens in these very step-like formal stages. And so instead, we tend to take the information processing view of adolescent thinking. And what instead we focus on is improvements in 4 specific areas during adolescence. So one is attention, okay? Adolescents are able to pay attention for longer periods of time. It doesn't seem like it today, with every time a phone chirps that someone has liked your thing on Instagram, or there's this alarm, or oh my gosh, your bus is coming in 7 minutes, no, now it's 6 minutes, no, now it's 2 minutes, right? So we're full of notifications and our attention is being pulled in lots of directions. But if you think about it for a moment, children's TV shows, right? TV shows aimed at children. Typically a 30-minute, so a half-hour show is going to be broken up into either 2 or 3 segments. So either it'll be 3 8-minute segments or 2 11 or 12-minute segments, because that's as long as children's attention span is. They can't follow the story and the characters and what's happening for much longer than that. As adolescents, you go sit through 2-hour-long movies and you can follow the story and the characters because you're able to pay attention for longer. You can read a book that's more than 20 pages as an adolescent. Young children, emergent readers, all those little reader books are about 20 pages and only with about 6 to 10 words per page, because that's all children can really do. So we see changes in attention. We see changes also in memory. So we see that memories get better. What we're storing as memories are better. Our ability to recall is better. What we can hold in short-term memory gets a little bit better. That allows us to work through more complex problems. We also see improvements in processing speed. Well, the faster we can process information, the more efficient we can be. And also with organization. And organization becomes important for that planning perspective, right? How do we plan for what's going to happen next? And that's something young children, not so good at planning. If you were to tell a young child, as I have done, to pack up, to pick what they need to go on vacation, you would get, in my child's case, a lot of books, some stuffed animals, and maybe some clothes. And I've had to look at my daughter, and this was again when we could travel, so she was younger then, because we haven't gone anywhere in a really long time. I'd be like, do you think you might need underwear? Oh, yeah. What about socks? Oh, yeah. Pants? Oh, yeah. Whoa, shoes? Yeah, right? So, but to her, like, oh, well, we're going away. I need books and I need toys. And I'm like, yeah, no, you need clothes. Like, you can't be naked. We're not taking you to a nudist colony yet. We're going to wait till you're a little older for that one, okay? So that, an adolescent, though, if you say, okay, we're going on vacation, pick out what you need, they're like, okay, well, we're going away for a week. So, well, I should definitely take at least 7 shirts. But then what if I get some dirty or like if it's really hot and I get really sweaty, I should probably take a few extras. Okay, so you walk in and they basically have their whole wardrobe laid out because they're like, I want to make sure I'm covered for every contingency. And you're like, okay, scale it back. That's a little too much. But they're able to think about that and get organized. It's why we're able to assign more complex projects to adolescents because you're able to make sense of things and plan for what it's going to look like, okay? Okay, for the adolescent brain, we've learned a lot about the brain, especially in the last 20 years with imaging. So being able to use things like fMRI, so that's functional magnetic resonance imaging, where we're able to have an adolescent be in a scanner and they're awake and we're asking them to do certain tasks and we're seeing which parts of their brain light up, have taught us so much more about the adolescent brain and how it works. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, not because I don't think it's important, but because I think, first of all, for those of you who are psych majors, you have already learned a lot of this in brain and behavior, or if you haven't taken brain and behavior yet, you will. And for those of you who aren't psychology majors, you probably are not as interested in knowing the nitty-gritty. And if you are, by all means, the textbook, which you should be reading, gives you a lot more information. But what I did find was this great little 4.5-minute YouTube video. So I'm going to want you to watch that. So you're going to go ahead and pause this as soon as I'm done talking, watch that, and then come back. And I would say, like, towards the end of the video, it kind of falls apart a little bit, but the beginning part is really quite, like, I would say the first 3.5 to 4 minutes is really quality. So go ahead and do that. So what changes in adolescence? Well, okay, we've got changes in brain structures. So particularly the prefrontal cortex. That's where we see some changes, some growth, some development. And these are the areas of planning, thinking ahead, impulse control, risk-taking, right? So the things that we know can be issues in adolescence, and also that we see those changes in what adolescents can now do as opposed to younger children. So delayed gratification is something that is easier to achieve in adolescence as opposed to young children, right? You know it's coming. It doesn't have to always be happening. And then also the limbic system, which is the part of our brain responsible for emotions, social information, and rewards and punishment. So we see changes in the limbic system as well, and as adolescents, we're better able to understand our emotions and to read emotions in other people. We're better able to process some of that social information. And essentially, these changes allow us to have sort of more advanced thinking abilities. In terms of changes in brain function, here we see that executive functioning, which really, when we think about executive function, we're really talking about that more advanced thinking, that better control. It's a lot of the stuff that happens in the prefrontal cortex, okay? So, and those things we were talking about earlier, memory, attention, processing speed, that all falls into executive function. And so we get better at regulating ourselves. We get better at being able to figure things out and make a plan and stick to it. That's all part of what happens in terms of changes in brain function. And then also this idea of functional connectivity, which is the extent to which multiple brain areas can function at the same time. And this improves in adolescence. We have more areas that can be active at the same time. So that enables us, let's say when watching a movie, we can be noticing the artistic components while still listening to the dialogue and also thinking about how we're a little hungry and need that other handful of popcorn right now. Okay, so we're able to have more going on and manage ourselves. And then also in terms of another thing that changes is this idea of the social brain. We become more receptive to social information and social cues from other people, and that can increase the impact of social influence and things like peer pressure. So we're more aware. We can sort of tell if someone gives us like a look that like they're disappointed or they want us to try something, things that might get lost when we're younger. But in adolescence, we're better able to recognize these social cues of other people and understand what they want a little bit more. And then sometimes it leads us to make decisions that might not be the best ones, but we're doing it because that social brain, that sense that we need to do this to remain part of our social group. So we sometimes make those decisions. Okay, in terms of individual differences in intelligence. So in the book, they talk quite a bit about the measurement of IQ and about IQ tests. And I'm going to just keep it pretty brief and say IQ tests aren't perfect. In fact, they're quite flawed. We use them because we don't really have a better way. So intelligence tests were first designed. So Alfred Binet, and he developed what is now known as the Stanford-Binet IQ test. He then collaborated with Stanford University. But Binet lived in France when he developed it. It was essentially designed to determine who wouldn't benefit from schooling, which sounds harsh, but that's how things were once upon a time. And essentially, the Stanford-Binet intelligence test is really good at picking up people on the very low end of IQ, and that was the idea, to pick up people who wouldn't benefit from schooling, and then also to pick up people at the really high end, people who we might consider gifted. The most common intelligence tests used in North America today are the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And so they're known as the WAIS and the WISC. And I've administered the WAIS and the WISC quite a few times in my career. They're really good at assessing different dimensions of intelligence, but they tend to all be dimensions related to what you would learn in formal schooling. We don't have a way of testing for your life skills and how adaptable you are. We don't have a way of testing for your emotional intelligence. So there's a lot of people out there who would score not so great on an IQ test, but who actually have quite a lot of intelligence in other areas that we don't assess. So as an example, I am not from the handiest people in the world. And if I end up with a flat tire, you better believe I'm calling AMA to have someone come fix my tire. Is there any reason that I can't figure out how to get out the jack and my spare and get the tire? No, of course not. I could figure it out. But I also figure out that paying for an AMA membership is much better for my sanity and my mental health. But there are other people who are like, why on earth wouldn't you just change your own flat? Why don't you change your own oil? Well, that's a whole other world that I wouldn't be doing either, right? we all have our skill sets. We all have the places where we've invested time. I've invested a lot of time in formal schooling, and they didn't teach me how to change a tire or change my oil as part of formal schooling. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm more intelligent than someone who can do that. In fact, I'm in awe of people who can do that, because I'm like, huh? I don't know how to do that. Okay, so that's one of the big problems with IQ. The other problem, particularly with the WAIS and the WISC, is that they are very America-centered. There are actually some US history questions on those. So someone from Canada who's never taken US history might appear to not be that intelligent because they don't know the answers to what are things that most Americans know. So culturally, there isn't a whole lot of sensitivity. And that also means that people from minority groups in the US might also do more poorly, because some of the things that are assumptions that are known amongst the majority might not be known by the minority. So IQ tests, they're problematic, but they're kind of the best of what we have. So we do use IQ tests. They're always meaned at 100. Both the WAIS and the WISC has a standard deviation of 15. So we know that the vast majority of people, again, if we think about a normal curve, 68% of our population is going to fall within one standard deviation in either direction. So between an IQ score of 85 and 115. So generally speaking, an IQ score between 85 and 115 is considered normal. From 115 to 130, we're getting into highly intelligent, and then 130 and beyond is our gifted range. From 85 to 70 is roughly our less intelligent, maybe struggling, and then below 70 is oftentimes the part of the population that is diagnosed with developmental intelligence disorder. So that's the population that, again, Binet was really interested in, people who might not benefit from regular schooling. That being said, today we know that people even with low IQ scores can benefit from schooling, and we believe in providing, and it's important for us to provide schooling at a level that is appropriate for all people. So we have a lot of special education programs out there. But again, back when these tests were first developed, the idea was actually to be exclusionary rather than to focus on inclusion. Another way of thinking about intelligence, and this is where culture comes in, is stuff that we got from Vygotsky. He introduced us to two really important concepts that are still very much used in education today, particularly in primary and secondary schools, but even to some extent, I know I think about these things oftentimes at the university level. The first is the zone of proximal development. And the idea behind the zone of proximal development is that we learn best when the information or the task we need to learn is just a little bit outside of our reach. So it's not so easy that we can learn it and be done. It's not so hard that we're going to get overly frustrated and give up, but it's just out of our reach. And with the help of a skilled person, so someone who is more knowledgeable, somebody who can complete the task, we're able to complete the task with that instruction and assistance. And so we don't just generally take a child and throw them into a swimming pool and go swim. It's not the best way to do it. I was a swim instructor for a lot of years. I don't advise that. Instead, we take children who don't know how to swim and don't know how to float, and we challenge them to start doing things like putting their face in the water, moving their hands and their legs in the water, all while holding on to them. And then, once they're able to do that comfortably, we move from a person holding on to them to using some sort of flotation device, right? And then, as they continue building up their awareness in the water, their skill set, we remove the flotation device. And at first, we don't go straight into teaching front crawl. We're like, and now you will learn dog paddle. You will learn how to move your hands and kick your legs in a very cursory way just to get you started. And then once you've mastered that, then we'll start going into stroke refinement. But we keep going in bits, but we don't throw a child into the water and say, go swim a lap of front crawl, right? They will drown, most likely. So that's the zone of proximal development. The other idea that Vygotsky introduced is this idea of scaffolding. And scaffolding is something I know that I'm certainly think about as a university instructor. I'm sure most elementary and secondary school instructors think about a lot, which is how do we build off of what you already know to have you learn more? And so for a lot of assignments that I give in classes, there will be that element, particularly thinking about in Psych 2285, where there's a written assignment that goes in 3 stages, so that once students have mastered the first stage, they're ready to move on to the second stage, and then the third. The third is what I actually want to see, but if I skip the first 2 steps, how do they get there? So we do things in a way that, again, we start small, and then we build on that to keep getting better at what we're doing. So this is the point where I am going to tell you the answer to the question on your quiz. So again, it's going to be question 9. It's pretty much almost always going to be question 9. The answer to question 9 on the quiz for cognitive transitions is C. The answer to question 9 for the quiz on cognitive transitions is C. Okay, so adolescent thinking in context. Okay. Let's first think about social cognition. Again, our next chapter is going to be on social transitions. Obviously, social components are really important in adolescence, and social cognition is really thinking about other people, thinking about interpersonal relationships, and also thinking about social institutions to some extent. Okay? And so when we think about social cognition in adolescence, we think about sort of those three pieces, which are also known as theory of mind, thinking about social relationships, and understanding social conventions. So with theory of mind, this is the ability to understand that others have beliefs, intentions, and knowledge that is different from our own. Not everybody thinks the same way we do. And at times, that can be really frustrating, right? Like, we'd love it if everybody thought like us, but they don't. So we understand that people have differing viewpoints, that they want to think about things in different ways, okay? In terms of thinking about social relationships, we're really talking here about understanding, whoops. What am I looking at here? Sorry, guys. I just got to look at my notes for a second here. Oh, I didn't write anything down about that because to me it was just that clear. So thinking about social relationship, I'm like, wait, why don't I have a note about that? Right, because I don't need one. So thinking about our relationships with other people, thinking about the relationships between other people, particularly in adolescence, and even now at this point in your adult lives, you probably have some friends and relationships that you're like, why are they with that person? What do they see in them? And part of it is we have to go back also to theory of mind and recognize that not everybody is looking for the same thing in a partner that you might be looking for. Now, sometimes you're right that that guy or that girl is no good for your friend or your loved one or your sibling. But sometimes it's just that they're looking for something different than what you're looking for. Okay? And then understanding social conventions. This has to do with understanding social conventions as a means to regulate people and their behavior. So understanding social conventions is understanding that there's a reason that we have laws. They're not, sometimes they seem pretty arbitrary, but really, like, killing someone is against the law, and there's good reason for that, right? Like, we don't go around killing people. Stealing is something else, and stealing is one that sometimes, and again, in adolescence especially, we think about it in different ways, like, well, if I really have no food, is it so wrong if I steal? Well, I don't know. Yes, by the way. Most likely because there are other ways for you to get food without stealing. But also then we think about, well, you know, if you're going to steal, is it going to be from like some small mom and pop shop where you stealing inventory actually really hurts their bottom line? Or are you going to go steal from like a soulless corporation like Walmart? And the problem is the soulless corporation like Walmart is going to then raise prices for all consumers to make up for the stealing they expect to happen. So everybody's going to pay more. The mom and pop shop, even if they caught you stealing, if you explained why you were stealing, they might let you go. They might not. Don't go out and test this out as a theory. But they might not parlay your theft onto everybody else. But we start to understand that there are rules and regulations for a reason. We understand, we might not agree with it. And again, I'm going to reference the current times we're living in with COVID. You know, going for a walk with a friend who doesn't live in your household and having to maintain 6 feet of distance might not make that much sense, right? Because you're like, we're outside, and particularly if you're masked, it's like, really? But at the same time, we understand that there are a lot of people out there who aren't following the rules, and so maybe we need to follow the rules. Number 1, to role model. Number 2, because there's a reason they came up with this, right? They didn't say 4 feet. They didn't say 12 feet. They said 6 feet because that seems to be how we control transmission a little bit better. So we understand, again, that these social conventions exist not to control people, but to regulate behavior so society can continue functioning, okay? We see what happens when people go all sorts of lawless, and it's not pretty. Another component that we think about with adolescent thinking is risk-taking. And risk-taking becomes really important to study in adolescence because the main health problems that adolescents have are caused by behavior that can be, can't read my writing. Okay. Oh well. That's no good. I'm like, I can't actually read my writing. All right, but anyway, what I can tell you is that, we're going to rephrase that here, that a lot of the health problems adolescents have come as a result of risk-taking behavior and things that we could do differently. So, unprotected sex, for one. Sexually transmitted infections, unintended pregnancy, using condoms would really prevent those by and large. But adolescents, again, we think about that personal fable. Well, I know I should use a condom, but that's not going to happen to me. Well, but it did, okay? Same thing with substance use. Well, I know people get addicted to heroin, but that's not going to happen to me, except it does. And what was my other one here? So substances, and reckless driving, right? So whether it's driving too fast, whether it's driving while intoxicated, whether it's driving while high, whether it's driving with too many people in the car and getting distracted with your really loud music, who knows? But we do see higher rates of car accidents and reckless driving in adolescents. Adolescents are more willing to take risks in certain ways that adults won't. And so one of the things that can sort of work with and kind of help us to reduce some of the risk-taking is what's known as behavioral decision theory. Now, most people, when given, choices, once they're into adolescence, will start to think about, okay, what are the benefits of this? What are the consequences? So kind of think about what are the pros and the cons of a particular situation, weighing out the consequences from the decision. So earlier I used an example of, I took my parents' car to go to this party and I promised them I wouldn't drink, but then I drank. And so what are my choices here? And so one choice is to get in the car and drive drunk home and take a big risk that something's going to happen. Could end up dead, could end up killing someone else, could end up, totaling the car, or could end up getting home and everything's just fine and nobody knows. But which of those 4, we don't know. Other option, well, I could have someone who wasn't drinking drive me home, and then in the morning explain to my parents that I didn't feel comfortable driving because I did drink, and so we do have to go back and pick up the car. Okay, so what are the consequences of that? Well, my parents will probably be pissed that I drank when I said I wouldn't, and they'll probably be annoyed that we have to go pick up the car, but they'll also probably be happy that I made the smarter decision and didn't drive after drinking. Okay, there's that. Other option is call your parents right then and there and say, I need you to come pick me up. I was drinking. So on the one hand, they're happy that you're calling. On the other hand, they're pissed off that you just woke them up in the middle of the night and that you broke your word. Another option is if there are 2 people there who are sober, have one person drive you home in your car or your parents' car, and have the other person follow behind in their car to bring that person then either back to the party or home. That one might not really have any consequences, right? So the consequence is that you're letting someone else drive your parents' car. Depending on what jurisdiction you're in and how long you've had your driver's license, there might be rules about 2 people under the age of 18 being in the car, but maybe the consequences on that one are a little bit better. That's behavioral decision theory, right? Thinking about not just what are the possibilities, but also thinking about what are the consequences of each possibility and then deciding which possibility might be the best one. We also then have to think about emotional and contextual influences on risk-taking. So this is things like peer pressure, impulsivity, reward seeking. So why are we taking the risk? Is it because our friends are encouraging us to do so? Is it because everybody's doing it, so why don't you do it? Is it because we just think it's a good idea? We think it'll make us feel good, right? Why do people drink? Usually adolescents aren't drinking because they love the taste of alcohol. I can tell you, based on an experience I had in adolescence, it was only a couple of years ago that I ever even attempted to drink gin again. Gin is nasty, especially if you're 16. But it was the only booze in the house, so we drank it. That was a mistake, right? So, but oftentimes we think that using drugs or drinking is going to make us feel better. So that's some of the emotional influence on risk-taking as well. And tied into this is this idea, I said reward seeking, is this idea of sensation seeking. Some adolescents are much higher on sensation seeking than others. And that means that they're searching for things that are going to give them that feeling of being high, not necessarily with drugs, but things like ziplining, things like skiing really fast, right? There's controlled skiing and there's like bomb straight down the mountain skiing. Driving really fast, right? Always sort of searching for that next little surge of adrenaline. That sensation seeking, we see more of that in adolescents, partially because of impulsivity, partially because adolescents are just trying to figure stuff out, right? And they like the rush. Another component of adolescent risk-taking is logic and intuition. What's really interesting is we know that logic really develops between childhood and adolescence, but then in adolescence, what happens is we learn to trust our intuition more. So oftentimes, we as humans don't do things that are logical. We know what the odds are, like how many of you have purchased lotto tickets? It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. I mean, I'm just as guilty. I have a threshold. Has to be over $35 million in the jackpot, right? Because somehow $34 million wouldn't change my life significantly, but 35, that's my magic number. And I don't always, it's not like I rush out to buy a Lotto Max ticket every time it's above 35 million, but if I happen to see that the jackpot is bigger than 35 million, yeah, I'll stop and buy a ticket. The chances, logically, the chances of me winning are so minuscule, but it doesn't matter, right? I get caught up in like, oh, what would I do, right? How nice would that be? So we do things all the time that aren't logical. But in adolescence, we start to trust our intuition. We start to trust that I don't have a great feeling about that, right? I don't really think I should get in a car with that person. I know that my friend just made a really compelling reason as to why we should cheat on our exams, but I don't think we should, right? So we start to trust our intuition a little bit more, and that continues to get better into adulthood as well. Okay, and then, oh, no, before I get to that point, I see that I forgot to mention with sensation seeking and risk taking, like some of the things that we do and contextual influences. I'm going to share a story I'm not that proud of. I'm not sure that I really want it to live on in recorded infamy for the rest of my life, but here goes. So in terms of adolescence, not always making the best decisions. I mentioned earlier that I used to work, I mentioned this in biological transitions, that I worked for many summers at overnight camps, at summer camps. And one of the camps that I worked at was about a mile away from my grandparents' cottage. So it was on the same lake as my grandparents' cottage, but down the highway, because we were on like a highway. It was about a mile, so just over 1.5 kilometers. And so sometimes me and my friends would head towards the cottage when we had a night off, just because it was somewhere we could go, we could hang out, we could take nice, clean, hot showers, we could watch TV. There was always food there for us, right? So we thought, no big deal. And so oftentimes someone would have a car or someone would give us a ride and then pick us up. And there was one night where someone had given me and one other friend a ride, but we were sort of on our own to get back. And we were like, okay, like it's a mile, we can walk it, no problem. But of course, we lost track of time, and now suddenly it's like almost curfew, and we're walking down a relatively deserted highway on the side of the road, recognizing that it would be really easy for us to get hit by the occasional car that comes by. And then suddenly, like a truck, like an 18-wheeler truck, pulls up next to us and is like, do you want to ride? Now, we were not hitchhiking. We were not planning on it. And my alarm bells were ringing, going like, no. We are two young females. I mean, like we were like 18 or 19, right? Like we're not exactly, we should not be getting into the cab of an 18-wheeler. This is pre-cell phones also, I gotta say. But we did. And he drove us the mile, or at that point, maybe half a mile, and dropped us off. And I was like shaking. And I was like, why did we just do that? But we made it back before curfew. So I think that's why we did it. I don't think I've ever told my parents about that. Risk taking. We do stupid shit as adolescents. We do things that now as a parent, if my daughter ever tried to pull that, oh my God, lock her up, right? Like she does not get to leave the house ever again. It's also a very different time, but what the hell was I thinking? What was my friend thinking saying, yeah, we should do this. This is a really good idea. No, it was a terrible idea, and we got really lucky that it turned out okay for us. Okay? So be smarter than me, please, and raise your children to be smarter than me. Lord knows I will never tell my daughter about that, so she better never see this video. Okay, so how do we reduce adolescent risk-taking? Well, first of all, as adults, we could actually share some of the stupid shit we did and why it was so stupid and why nobody should ever think about doing it, just like I just did. Because I think one of the things that happens oftentimes as adults, we think, well, we're not going to talk about the stuff we did because we don't want to give kids or adolescents any ideas. We don't want them to think that because we did it, it's okay for them to do it. But then we just watch the children and adolescents in our lives repeat the same mistakes we've made. So I think one piece that can certainly help is by sharing information. Another is things like the assignment I've given you for your final end of term assignment of developing a workshop. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on a risk-taking behavior. Of course, you guys know that you can do it on anything you want, but wouldn't it maybe make sense to talk about things with a group of adolescents about something that could get them in trouble, about why maybe there are some risks that are good to take and some risks that are not so good to take? So this may start getting your creative juices flowing a little bit, thinking about what would you want to present to a group of adolescents to help them make better choices. Okay, and so then this takes us to the end of the formal lecture. I just want to remind you again that this week you have an article to read. So please read the article prior to our class meeting and prior to taking the quiz for the chapter. It's by Galinacki. It's called The Imaginary Audience and the Personal Fable, a test of Elkind's theory of adolescent egocentrism, so very much related to what we were talking about. So again, for accessing materials on the library website, just make sure you're signed in to the library website. And then for your reflection, you may want to use these questions as a guide. You may not, and again, that's fine. Do you think the personal fable and imaginary audience constructs apply to all adolescents? Is it surprising that older adolescents exhibit more self-consciousness than younger adolescents? And again, that's based on this study. And are gender differences important in considering Elkind's theory?